Alexander Carter was a man who had mastered the art of control. As the CEO of one of the most influential investment firms on Wall Street, his days were meticulously planned, his decisions razor-sharp, and his vision unshakable. Yet, beneath the polished exterior and the towering Manhattan skyline, Alexander carried a void he rarely acknowledged, a silence that even the hum of success couldn't fill. One brisk afternoon, as his luxury sedan weaved through the chaotic streets of New York, Alexander's disciplined routine was unexpectedly interrupted. At a red light on Fifth Avenue, amidst the flurry of impatient horns and bustling pedestrians, his gaze was drawn to an unusual sight. A woman in a wheelchair, flanked by two boys, offered small flower bouquets to passing drivers. Her posture was dignified, and her eyes were resilient despite the weariness on her face. But it wasn't her that caught Alexander's breath. It was the boys. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old, but something about their faces struck him deeply. The same sharp green eyes, the same determined expressions. For a fleeting moment, it was as if he was staring at a reflection of his childhood. The light turned green, and an impatient honk jolted Alexander back to reality. He accelerated away, the boys' faces lingering in his mind like an unfinished melody. He tried to shake the feeling, dismissing it as a strange coincidence. After all, New York City was full of fleeting encounters and stories that never intersected again. But as Alexander walked into his towering office in Midtown Manhattan, he realized this moment was different. Those boys weren't strangers. They couldn't be. The resemblance was too uncanny, too precise. And the weight of their mother's eyes, filled with something between sadness and strength, refused to fade from his thoughts. Who were they? Why did they stir something so deep, so unexpected in him? Could this be a fragment of a past he had long buried, now resurfacing to demand his attention? For a man who thrived on control, Alexander was about to face the one thing he couldn't manipulate, his conscience. This story is just beginning. As Alexander delves into the truth, he uncovers secrets that will change everything he thought he knew about himself and his carefully constructed life. If you're ready for an emotional journey filled with family, redemption, and hard-earned second chances, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Let's unravel this tale together. The elevator doors closed behind Alexander as he entered his luxurious corner office, but the tranquility he typically found in the panoramic view of Manhattan was absent. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the glass desk and leaned against the massive window, staring at the sprawling city below. His mind, however, wasn't on the upcoming board meeting or the next big deal. It was on those boys. The faces, the green eyes. The sense of familiarity felt almost invasive. He shook his head, trying to focus. Alexander prided himself on compartmentalizing emotions, pushing personal distractions aside to maintain his legendary sharpness. But no matter how hard he tried, those fleeting moments at the intersection refused to loosen their grip on him. He replayed the scene in his mind, the woman in the wheelchair, the boys' tired yet determined gazes, the fragile bouquet they carried with trembling hands. A knock at the door snapped him out of his reverie. His assistant, Claire, entered cautiously, holding a tablet loaded with the day's agenda. "Mr. Carter, the directors are waiting for your input on the quarter's projections," she said, her tone professional but tinged with curiosity. She had never seen him this distracted. "Tell them to proceed without me for now," Alexander replied, unusually curt. "I need a moment." Claire blinked, clearly surprised. Alexander Carter was always one to attend meetings or defer responsibilities. Still, she nodded and left quietly, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Alexander sat down and opened his laptop. Usually, this action would signal the start of his daily productivity ritual. Instead, he searched for something he didn't even fully understand. He typed "Manhattan Flower Vendor Wheelchair Boys" into the search bar, his fingers hesitating as if looking for them confirmed the situation. The results yielded nothing specific. Frustration bubbled under the surface. Alexander was not a man accustomed to dead ends. If this were a business deal, he would have leveraged every resource to solve the problem within hours. But this was something entirely different. Something personal. Something unsettling. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as a thought began to form. Had fate placed those boys in his path for a reason? By the following day, Alexander's restlessness had grown unbearable. As he dressed for the day, he selected a darker, more casual outfit, something he hadn't done in years. His usual tailored suits felt too rigid for what he was about to do. "I need to know," he muttered as he grabbed his keys. Instead of heading to the office, Alexander drove back to Fifth Avenue, navigating the congested streets with an unusual urgency. He parked near the intersection, scanning the bustling crowd for any sign of the woman or the boys. The scene was chaotic as usual. Street vendors, hurried pedestrians, honking cars, but they were nowhere to be found. A sense of frustration and unease settled over him. Had they moved to another location? Were they even in the city today? He cursed himself for not asking more questions during their first encounter. Feeling defeated, Alexander walked into a nearby cafe and sat by the window, fixing his eyes on the street outside. He ordered a coffee but barely touched it, his fingers tapping impatiently against the table. Minutes turned into an hour, but the intersection remained void of the faces he was desperate to see. "Are you waiting for someone?" the waiter asked, noticing Alexander's distant expression. Alexander glanced up, startled by the question. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice clipped. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He was waiting for answers, waiting for clarity, waiting for something he couldn't yet name. Before leaving, he made a decision. He would use the resources if he couldn't find them alone. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a need, a burning question that had to be answered. That afternoon, Alexander called James Harrison, the most discreet and efficient private investigator he knew. James had helped him untangle corporate scandals before, but this was the first time Alexander needed him for something personal. "I need you to find someone," Alexander said without preamble when James arrived at his office. James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for further instructions. "There's a woman in a wheelchair, probably in her mid-30s. She was selling flowers at 5th and 45th. She was with two boys, twins, about 6 years old," Alexander explained, his tone brisk yet strained. "Find out everything you can about them. Who they are, where they live, everything." James jotted down the details, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any additional information? Anything that might narrow the search?" Alexander hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "The boys, they look like me. When I was their age." James didn't react outwardly, but the statement's weight wasn't lost on him. He nodded. "Understood. I'll get started immediately." Alexander felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension as James left the office. He had taken the first step toward unraveling the mystery, but deep down, he feared the answers that might come. What if those boys were connected to him? And if they were, what did that mean for the life he had built so meticulously? For a man who thrived on clarity, Alexander Carter was venturing into uncharted territory. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he was ready for the truth. 3 days felt like an eternity to Alexander as he awaited James Harrison's findings. Each hour was a slow crawl through uncertainty. His usually occupied mind was now fixated on possibilities that intrigued and unnerved him. He immersed himself in work, but numbers and charts couldn't hold his attention. The faces of the boys, and the haunting question of who they were, consumed his thoughts. On the morning of the 4th day, his phone buzzed, jolting him from restless sleep. It was James. "Alexander, I have some information." "We should meet," James said, his tone measured. "Come to my office in an hour," Alexander replied, sitting up and already sensing the gravity in James's voice. James entered the expansive office an hour later, a thick folder tucked under his arm. He closed the door behind him and sat across from Alexander, who eyed the folder as if it held the answers to the universe. "What did you find?" Alexander asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his impatience. James opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents. The woman's name is Emily Dawson, 36 years old. She was once a promising economist, graduated top of her class from NYU. Alexander felt a twinge of recognition at the name, but stayed silent. About 7 years ago, she was involved in a severe car accident. A drunk driver hit her vehicle, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down, James continued, sliding a photo of Emily's pre-accident across the desk. Alexander picked up the photo. Emily's eyes sparkled with ambition and joy, a stark contrast to the weary eyes he had seen at the intersection. Memories stirred faintly, but he couldn't quite place her. She has twin sons, Ethan and Caleb Dawson, both 6 years old, James added, placing a picture of the boys next to Emily's. Alexander's breath caught. The boys' faces were more evident in these photos, the same green eyes and brow arch. It was like looking into a mirror reflecting on his childhood. Who was their father? Alexander asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. James hesitated. There are no records of the father's identity. No name on the birth certificates. But there's more. He pulled out copies of emails and phone records. Emily tried to contact you multiple times about 6 years ago. Emails, phone calls, none of which received a response. Alexander shook his head in disbelief. That's impossible. I never received any messages from her. James looked at him carefully. Is it possible they were intercepted? Do you recall Emily Dawson at all? Alexander searched his memory. Then it hit him, a summer internship at an economic forum in New York about 7 years ago. He met an Emily, brilliant, captivating, with a sharp wit that matched his own. They spent several weeks collaborating on a project, and their professional relationship had briefly crossed into something more personal. But their paths diverged when Alexander was called back to manage a critical situation at his firm. I remember her, he said quietly. We worked together for a short time, but we lost touch. James nodded. It seems she didn't lose touch with you. At least, she tried not to. Alexander felt a surge of guilt and confusion. But I never received any messages. How could that be? James leaned forward. I did some digging. When Emily tried to contact you, your emails and calls were managed by your assistant, Sophia Bennett. Alexander frowned. Sophia? Yes, she was efficient, but I can't imagine she would withhold personal messages. People have their reasons, James said cautiously. Perhaps it's worth speaking to her. Alexander clenched his jaw. Sophia had been more than just an assistant back then. They had a brief romantic involvement that ended amicably when she left the company for another opportunity. Could she have kept Emily's messages from him? Thank you, James. This gives me a place to start, Alexander said. Standing up, send me everything you have. As James left, Alexander felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. If what James had uncovered was true, he might have 2 sons he never knew about. Sons who had struggled alongside their mother while he remained blissfully unaware. He needed to find out the truth, and only one person could give him answers. Later that day, Alexander located Sophia Bennett's contact information. She was now a partner at a successful PR firm in Manhattan. He scheduled a meeting to discuss potential business collaborations. Sophia greeted him warmly when he arrived at her sleek, modern office. Alexander, it's been too long, she said, offering a gracious smile. Sophia, he replied, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for making time to see me. Of course. Always a pleasure to reconnect, she said, gesturing for him to sit. They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes before Alexander steered the conversation to his real purpose. Sophia, I came here to discuss something from the past, he began, overseeing her reaction. Her smile faltered slightly. Oh, do you remember Emily Dawson? Sophia's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. The name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Alexander leaned forward. She was an economist I worked with briefly 7 years ago. She tried to contact me multiple times, but I never received any messages. I was wondering if you might know anything about that. Sophia's posture stiffened. Alexander, it's been years. I handled a lot of your communications back then. Exactly, he said, his tone sharpening. Which is why I'm asking if you intercepted any messages from her. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her manicured hands. Why is this so important now? Because she has twin sons who may be mine, he said bluntly. And if you prevented her from reaching me, I need to know. Sophia looked up, a mixture of guilt and defiance in her eyes. What difference does it make now? You've built your life. She's moved on. Anger flashed through him. It makes all the difference, Sophia. Did you withhold her messages? She sighed heavily. Fine. Yes, I did. I thought I was protecting you. From distractions, from unnecessary complications. Protecting me? Alexander echoed, disbelief coloring his words. You took it upon yourself to decide what I should or shouldn't know about my life? I was your assistant, Alexander. My job was to manage your communications and keep you focused. You crossed a line, he said coldly. A line that has had profound consequences. She met his gaze, unrepentant. You were always so driven, so focused on your career. I didn't think you'd want someone from a brief fling derailing that. Alexander stood up abruptly. You had no right. Maybe not, Sophia admitted. But what's done is done. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. You've meddled in more than just my career, Sophia. You've kept me from my children. I won't forget that. Alexander felt a storm of emotions as he left her office. Anger, regret, determination. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was devastating. He needed to see Emily. He needed to face the reality of what had happened and take responsibility. The following day, Alexander Stude was outside a modest apartment building in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. It was a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to, but it exuded a warmth that his penthouse lacked. He clutched the folder containing James's findings, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed the buzzer for Emily Dawson's apartment. A crackling voice came through. Yes? Emily, it's Alexander Carter. We need to talk, he said, trying to steady his voice. There was a long pause before she responded. I don't think that's a good idea. Please, Emily. It's important. I promise I won't take much of your time. Another silence followed, and then the door buzzed open. He climbed the stairs, each step heavy with anticipation. When he reached her door, it opened before he could knock. Emily sat in her wheelchair, her expression guarded. Come in, she said tersely. Alexander entered the small but cozy apartment. Children's drawings adorned the walls, and toys were neatly arranged in a corner. The scent of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. Thank you for seeing me, he said. Sitting on the sofa, she gestured to. What do you want, Alexander? She asked, positioning her wheelchair opposite him. He took a deep breath. I recently discovered that you tried to contact me years ago. About Ethan and Caleb. Her eyes flashed with a mix of surprise and anger. Years too late, it seems. I didn't receive your messages, he said earnestly. My assistant at the time, Sophia Bennett, intercepted them. I had no idea until now. Emily crossed her arms. Convenient excuse. He opened the folder and handed her the evidence James had compiled. These are copies of your emails and proof that I never saw them. Sophia admitted to deleting them. She glanced over the documents, but remained skeptical. And what am I supposed to do with this information now? Emily, if I had known, he began, but she cut him off. If you had known, what? She challenged. Would you have stepped in, claimed responsibility, or would you have dismissed me as a burden? He swallowed hard. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of their lives now. I want to support you. All of you. She shook her head. You don't get to walk in after 6 years and decide to play the hero. I'm not trying to be a hero, he said softly. I just want to do what's right. A door creaked open down the hallway, and 2 small faces peeked out. Ethan and Caleb. They whispered to each other before stepping cautiously into the living room. Mom, who is this? Caleb asked, his eyes darting between Alexander and Emily. Emily hesitated. Boys, this is Mr. Carter. He's an old friend. Alexander felt a pang at being introduced so distantly, but understood her caution. Hello, he said, offering a gentle smile. It's nice to meet you. The boys murmured polite hellos, their curiosity evident. Why don't you two go play in your room? Emily suggested. They nodded and retreated, glancing back as they disappeared down the hall. After they were gone, Alexander turned back to Emily. They're remarkable, she sighed, her expression softening slightly. They are my world. I can see that, he said. Emily, please, let me help. I know I have no right to ask, but I want to get to know them, to support you in any way I can. She looked at him for a long moment, the walls she'd built over the years wavering just a bit. It's not that simple. I understand it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes, he insisted. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping into her features. Do you have any idea what it's been like? Raising them alone? Dealing with the accident, the medical bills, the daily challenges? I can only imagine, he admitted. And I'm sorry you had to go through it without support. Sorry doesn't change the past, she said quietly. No, it doesn't, he agreed. But maybe it can change the future. She considered his words, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. The boys deserve to know their father. But I need to protect them. I can't have you come into their lives and then disappear if things get complicated. I won't disappear, Alexander promised. Let me prove it to you. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, we can start slowly. But if I sense that you're not committed, this ends. Thank you, Emily, he said sincerely. You won't regret it. Over the next few weeks, Alexander began to visit regularly, bringing something small, a book, a puzzle, a batch of cookies from a bakery he discovered. He spent time with Ethan and Caleb, learning about their interests, dreams, and favorite superheroes. At first, the boys were reserved, unsure of this new presence in their lives. But Alexander was patient. He helped them with homework, played board games, and even attempted to cook dinner one evening, resulting in laughter as they ordered pizza to replace his culinary disaster. Ethan looked up at him one afternoon as they built a model rocket together. Mr. Carter, do you have kids? Alexander paused. Well, Emily, who was watching from the kitchen doorway, held her breath. I don't have any children besides you two, he said gently. Caleb furrowed his brow. What do you mean? Alexander glanced at Emily, who gave a subtle nod. He took a deep breath. Ethan, Caleb, I'm your father. The boys looked at each other, processing the revelation. Really? Ethan asked, his eyes wide. Yes, Alexander confirmed. I didn't know until recently, but I want you to know I'm here now. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. Why weren't you here before? Alexander's heart ached. It's complicated, but the important thing is that I'm here now, and I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me. Ethan nodded slowly. Can you come to our school play next week? Alexander smiled, relief washing over him. I wouldn't miss it for the world. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Alexander and Emily sat together on the small balcony overlooking the street. The air was incredible, the city sounds muted in the distance. You handled that well, Emily said softly. I was nervous, he admitted. They're incredible kids. She nodded. They are. He turned to her. Emily, I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm committed to them and to supporting you. She looked down at her hands. It's still hard for me to trust this is real. I understand, he said. But I'm not going anywhere. She met his gaze, vulnerability shining in her eyes. I want to believe that. He reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. Then let me show you. Emily allowed herself a small smile for the first time since he'd walked back into her life. One day at a time. In the following days, AI ensured Emily and the boys, who were cared for, he discreetly paid off her medical bills and arranged renovations to make their apartment more accessible. When Emily discovered his actions, she confronted him. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't need charity, she said firmly. It's not charity, he replied. It's me taking responsibility. Please let me help. She sighed. I don't want the boys to think money solves everything. They won't, he assured her, because they'll see that what matters is being there. Physically, emotionally, she considered his words. All right, but we make decisions together, okay? Agreed, he said, smiling. One evening, Ethan spoke up as they sat around the dinner table. Dad, will you come to the park with us this weekend? Alexander's heart swelled at the word dad. Absolutely. We can play some baseball if you like. Caleb grinned. Mom can come too. Emily laughed lightly. I might slow you down in the wheelchair. Nonsense, Alexander said. We'll make it a family day. She looked at him, warmth in her eyes. A family day sounds nice. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Alexander and his sons grew stronger. Emily began to let down her guard, envisioning a future where they navigated life together, not as separate entities, but as a united family. One afternoon, Alexander received a call from James Harrison. Alexander, I thought you'd like to know that Sophia Bennett has been charged with obstruction and fraud for intercepting your communications. Alexander sighed. Thank you for letting me know, James. Also, there's another matter. Your brother, Daniel Carter, also seems to have had a hand in this. Alexander's brow furrowed. Daniel? What are you talking about? It appears he collaborated with Sophia to keep Emily's messages from you. He saw her as a threat to your focus and, by extension, the company's success. Alexander felt a cold anger rise within him. I'll handle it. Thanks, James. After ending the call, he sat in silence. The betrayal cut deep, not just from Sophia but from his brother. That evening, Alexander confronted Daniel at his townhouse. Alex, to what do I owe the pleasure? Daniel greeted him, a glass of whiskey in hand. Did you conspire with Sophia Bennett to keep Emily Dawson's messages from me? Alexander asked bluntly. Daniel's expression flickered. Why are you dredging up the past? Answer the question, Alexander demanded. Daniel sighed, setting down his glass. Fine. Yes, I did. You were on the cusp of greatness. I couldn't let some woman and her potential scandal derail everything we'd worked for. Alexander stared at him in disbelief. You had no right to interfere in my personal life. I was protecting our legacy, Daniel retorted. And look at you now, successful, powerful. Wasn't I right? No, Alexander said coldly, because while I thrived, my sons grew up without their father, and Emily struggled alone. Daniel scoffed. So now you're playing the martyr? I'm correcting a wrong you helped create. Daniel shrugged. Do what you want, but don't forget who stood by you all these years. Alexander shook his head. You didn't stand by me. You manipulated me, and I won't let it continue. He turned and left, a sense of finality in his stride. Returning home, Alexander felt the weight of betrayal, but also a renewed determination to focus on what truly mattered, his family. He shared the revelations with Emily, who listened with empathy. I'm sorry you had to go through that, she said, comforting his arm. He covered her hand with his. I'm the one who should be sorry, for everything you've endured because of the people around me. She gave a small smile. We're here now. That's what counts. He nodded. And I intend to make the most of it. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. Emily and the boys moved into a new home, a place they chose together, where accessibility wasn't an afterthought but a design feature. The house was filled with laughter, the walls adorned with new memories they created as a family. Alexander reduced his workload, delegating responsibilities to trusted colleagues. He didn't want to miss any more milestones, school recitals, soccer games, bedtime stories. One evening, as they sat around the fire pit in their backyard, Ethan asked, Dad, can we go camping someday? Alexander smiled. Absolutely. We'll plan a trip soon. Emily chuckled. Just make sure there's a comfortable bed for me. Caleb grinned. We can get you a super deluxe sleeping bag. They all laughed, the sound blending with the crackling of the fire. Alexander looked at Emily, his eyes reflecting the flames. There's something I'd like to discuss with you. She raised an eyebrow playfully. Oh. He took a deep breath. I want to create a foundation, a charity to help families dealing with challenges like the ones you faced. Medical expenses, single parenthood, accessibility needs. Her eyes widened. Alexander, that's incredible. I was hoping we could run it together, he said. Combine your expertise in economics and your first-hand experience to make a real difference. She smiled warmly. I'd love that. He reached over and took her hand. You've shown me what truly matters. It's time I use my resources for something meaningful. She squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you. The Carter Dawson Foundation was established in the following months, quickly gaining recognition for its impactful work. Emily and Alexander worked side by side, their skills complementing each other. The boys often joined them at events, helping and learning the value of giving back. One night, Alexander and Emily stood on a balcony overlooking the city after a successful fundraising gala. Remember when we first met? She mused. He chuckled. You mean when you challenged my economic model in front of a room full of executives? She laughed. Well, someone had to point out the flaws. He turned to face her. You've always been unafraid to speak your mind. She met his gaze. It's one of the things you love about me. He smiled softly. It is. A comfortable silence settled between them. Emily, he began, his tone serious. I know we've been building this life together, and I cherish every moment. I want to make it official. Her heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a simple yet elegant ring. Will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes. Alexander, I love you, Emily. More than I thought possible. You've taught me what being part of something bigger than myself is. Means, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced, the city lights twinkling around them like stars. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair attended by close friends and family. Ethan and Caleb stood proudly beside their father, matching grins on their faces. Daniel was notably absent, having distanced himself after their confrontation. Alexander had made peace with it, focusing instead on the family he was building. As Alexander and Emily exchanged vows, the room had no dry eye. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but it led them to a place of profound love and commitment. In his vows, Alexander said, Emily, you came into my life like a whisper, and your love became the loudest truth I've ever known. I promise to stand by you, to cherish you, and to face whatever comes our way together. Emily smiled through her tears. Alexander, you once lived behind walls built by ambition and guarded by solitude. I'm grateful those walls came down, allowing us to find each other again. I promise to love you, to support you, and to continue building this beautiful life with you. Alexander felt a peace he'd never known as they danced under the soft glow of lanterns, surrounded by those they loved. The path to this moment had been unexpected and, at times, painful, but it had led him to a place of fulfillment and joy. He looked down at Emily, her head resting on his shoulder. Thank you for giving me a second chance. She looked up, her eyes shining. Thank you for taking it. Ethan and Caleb ran up, hugging them both. Group hug, Caleb exclaimed. They laughed, enveloped in the embrace of their children. At that moment, Alexander knew that this was the legacy he wanted. Not one of wealth or power, but of love, family, and making a difference. The weeks after the wedding marked the beginning of a new chapter for Alexander and Emily, not just as partners, but as a united family. Life slowly settled into a rhythm, blending Alexander's structured world with the warmth and chaos of Emily and the boys. Despite the joy of their union, Alexander knew there was still work to be done. While growing up, his relationship with Ethan and Caleb still had gaps he needed to bridge. One Saturday morning, Alexander planned an outing to the park. He wanted to connect with the boys in a natural and fun way. Emily watched from the doorway as he packed a picnic basket with snacks and drinks. You're nervous, she teased, a smile on her lips. I'm a businessman, Emily. I'm not used to impressing 6-year-olds, he replied, shaking his head with a wry grin. She walked over and touched his arm. You don't have to impress them. Just be yourself. They already look up to you more than you realize. Her words comforted him as they gathered the boys and headed to the park. Once there, Alexander set up a kite, something he hadn't done since childhood. Ethan and Caleb watched skeptically as he fumbled with the strings. Do you even know how to fly that? Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow in a way that reminded Alexander of himself. Of course, Alexander replied, though the tangled strings in his hands suggested otherwise. Caleb giggled. You look like you're tying a knot, not flying a kite. Alexander laughed, the boys light-hearted, teasing easing his nerves. With some trial and error, he finally got the kite soaring high into the air. The boys cheered, their laughter filling the park as they took turns holding the string. Later, they played soccer on a grassy field. Despite their lack of practice, Alexander threw himself into the game, chasing after the ball with determination and clumsy effort. When Ethan scored a goal against him, Caleb shouted, Dad, you're not supposed to let him win. Alexander froze at the word dad, his heart swelling. It was the first time either boy had addressed him that way. He smiled, ruffling Caleb's hair. Well, I guess I need to up my game, huh? By the end of the day, Ethan looked up at him as they packed up to leave. This was the best day ever. Can we do it again soon? Alexander crouched down to their level, his voice steady but full of emotion. I promise we'll have many more days like this. From a distance, Emily watched, her heart warming at the sight. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of completeness. While Alexander focused on strengthening his bond with his family, the shadow of his brother Daniel loomed large. Despite the joy of his new life, Alexander couldn't shake the betrayal that had come to light. He knew he needed closure for himself and Emily's boys, whose lives had been irreparably altered by Daniel's actions. One evening, after tucking the boys into bed, Alexander sat with Emily on their balcony. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a serene contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Emily, he began, his tone serious. I need to talk to Daniel. She frowned slightly, placing her hand over his. Are you sure? After everything he's done? I am. I need answers. I need to know why he did it, and to make sure he doesn't interfere in our lives again. She nodded, her gaze soft but firm. Just promise me you'll put us first, no matter what happens. I promise, he said, squeezing her hand. The following day, Alexander called Daniel, requesting a meeting. His brother agreed reluctantly, the tension palpable even over the phone. They met at a private club, a place they had frequented in better times. Alex, Daniel greeted him stiffly, gesturing for him to sit. This feels formal. What's on your mind? Alexander didn't mince words. I know what you did, Daniel. You worked with Sophia to sabotage Emily's attempts to reach me. Daniel's expression hardened. I won't deny it. But I had my reasons. Reasons? Alexander's voice was cold. You kept me from my sons. From Emily. Do you have any idea what they went through? Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms defensively. You were so focused, so driven. I was trying to protect that. Protect our legacy. You weren't protecting me, Alexander shot back. You were protecting yourself. Your fear of being overshadowed, of losing your place. Daniel's silence was telling, his eyes flickering with guilt. I made a mistake. But what's done is done. No, Alexander said firmly. What's done can be confronted, and it can be corrected. But you've lost my trust. You've lost your place in my life. Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. You're overreacting. I'm not, Alexander said, rising to leave. I'm moving on. And you're not part of the future I'm building. As he walked out, Alexander felt a weight lift. The ties that had once bound him to his brother were severed, but the freedom that followed was worth the pain. That evening, Alexander returned home to the warmth of his family. Emily greeted him with a questioning look, but he wrapped his arms around her. It's done, he said softly. Daniel's out of our lives. She hugged him back, whispering, Good. We don't need him. Ethan and Caleb ran in, interrupting the moment with excited chatter about their school projects. Alexander smiled, kneeling to listen intently. As the boys shared their stories, Alexander realized that this was his legacy, not the empire he'd built or the wealth he'd amassed, but the family he had found and their love. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The past no longer held him captive. He would cherish and protect his future with Emily and their boys. The days following Alexander's confrontation with Daniel were filled with closure. However, for Alexander, closure wasn't enough. He wanted to take the pain and betrayal of the past and turn it into something meaningful, something that would ensure Emily, Ethan, and Caleb never faced the hardships they had endured alone again. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Alexander spoke up. There's something I want to share with you all, he began. Looking around the table, the boys were halfway through their plates of spaghetti, and Emily's attentive eyes met his. What is it, Dad? Caleb asked, his curiosity piqued. Alexander smiled, but there was a weight to his words. I've been thinking about how much you and your mom have been through, and how many other families out there face the same challenges. I want to start something to help them. Emily tilted her head slightly. What are you thinking? A foundation, Alexander replied, focused on helping single-parent families, especially those with medical challenges or financial struggles. It'll provide resources, support, and opportunities for people to rebuild their lives. The table fell silent momentarily, the weight of his words settling over them. Then Emily reached across and placed her hand on his. That's an incredible idea, Alexander. You think so? He asked, his voice softening. I do, she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. It's exactly the kind of thing that could make a real difference. Ethan chimed in, his youthful enthusiasm shining through. Can we help too? Like, maybe at events or something? Caleb nodded eagerly. Yeah, we could talk to other kids. Alexander laughed, his heart swelling with pride. Of course, you can help. This is something we'll all do together. Over the following weeks, Alexander threw himself into the project, working closely with Emily to shape the foundation's vision. He enlisted her expertise in economics and community outreach, ensuring that the initiative would address the real needs of families like theirs. They named it the Dawson-Carter Foundation, a blend of their shared journey and commitment. The foundation's launch event was scheduled for a crisp autumn evening at a renovated community center in the Bronx, an intentional choice to honor Emily's roots. Once on the brink of closure, the center had been revitalized with funds from Alexander and Emily's efforts. Now, it stood as a beacon of hope for the neighborhood. As the event began, Alexander stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He glanced at Emily, who reviewed her speech, her calm confidence reminding him why he admired her so profoundly. You're going to be amazing, he said, squeezing her hand. She smiled. We both are. The boys, dressed in matching blazers, peeked out from behind the curtain. Whoa, there are so many people, Ethan whispered. Are we going to talk in front of them? Caleb asked nervously. You'll do great, Alexander assured them. Just speak from your heart. When it was their turn to address the audience, the family walked onto the stage together. The room was filled with supporters, community leaders, and families eager to hear about the foundation's mission. Emily spoke first, her voice steady and heartfelt. For years, my boys and I struggled. We faced challenges that felt insurmountable, and there were moments I thought we might not make it. But we found strength in each other and the kindness of those who helped us along the way. That's what this foundation is about, offering that same kindness and support to others. Alexander stepped forward next, his gaze sweeping the audience. I built a life focused on success, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what matters. This foundation is my way of making things right, not just for my family, but for all the families who need someone in their corner. Finally, Ethan and Caleb took the microphone, their youthful voices cutting through the room's hush. We're proud of our mom and dad, Ethan said, his cheeks pink with nervousness. And we hope this foundation helps many kids like us. Caleb added, if you ever feel like giving up, don't. Some people care about you. The audience erupted into applause, the moment's warmth filling the room. As the family stepped off the stage, Alexander felt a sense of fulfillment, unlike anything he had experienced. The foundation quickly gained traction, becoming a symbol of resilience and hope. Programs were launched to provide scholarships for children, career training for single parents, and medical support for those in need. Emily and Alexander worked tirelessly, and their partnership grew stronger with each success. As Alexander reviewed the foundation's progress reports in his office one day, his assistant knocked gently. Mr. Carter, there's someone here to see you, she said. Who is it? He asked, not looking up from his desk. A woman named Mrs. Ramos. She said she received a scholarship for her son through the foundation and wanted to thank you personally. Alexander set down his pen. Send her in. The woman entered, her hands clasped tightly around a small photo frame. Mr. Carter, she began, her voice trembling. I just wanted to thank you. Your foundation gave my son the chance to go to college. He's the first in our family ever to have that opportunity. Alexander stood, moved by her gratitude. Mrs. Ramos, the thanks belong to you. You're the one who raised him and believed in his potential. She smiled, tears streaming down her cheeks. It wouldn't have been possible without you and your wife. After she left, Alexander sat silently, the weight of her words settling over him. This was what he had always longed for. A legacy built not on wealth or ambition, but on the lives he had touched. As the months passed, the foundation became a cornerstone of their lives. Emily's flower shop flourished, a testament to her resilience and creativity. The boys excelled in school, their confidence growing with each passing day. And Alexander, once consumed by ambition, found himself thriving in ways he never imagined. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Caleb looked up from his plate. "Dad, can we help even more people someday?" Alexander smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "That's the plan, buddy. Together, we'll keep making a difference." Emily watched them, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt hope but certainty, that their family had found its place in the world. As the Dawson-Carter Foundation grew, so did the demands on Alexander and Emily's time. Balancing their professional commitments with family life was no small feat yet. Despite the long days and sleepless nights, they found ways to stay connected as a family. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One chilly November evening, Alexander was at the Foundation's headquarters reviewing the final details of an upcoming charity gala. Emily had been working late at her flower shop, preparing for the holiday rush. At home, the boys were under the watchful eye of a neighbor when the call came in. "Mr. Carter?" The voice on the other end said urgently. "This is St. Vincent's Hospital. Your wife has been in an accident." The words hit Alexander like a blow. His breath caught in his throat. "What happened? Is she all right?" "She's stable, but you should come immediately," the nurse replied. Without a second thought, Alexander grabbed his coat and raced to the hospital. The drive felt endless, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. By the time he arrived, his hands were trembling. A nurse led him to Emily's room. She was awake but pale, with a cast on her left arm and a faint bruise on her cheek. "Emily," Alexander breathed, rushing to her side. He gently took her uninjured hand in his. "What happened?" She gave him a tired smile. "A car skidded on black ice and hit me as I was leaving the shop. The paramedics said I was lucky." "Lucky?" His voice cracked. "You're lying here, injured, and calling it luck?" "Alexander," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "I'm okay. The boys are okay. That's what matters." Her calmness grounded him, but the fear in his chest remained. "Emily, I don't want you working late anymore. We'll hire more staff for the shop. Whatever it takes to keep you safe." She shook her head gently. "I can't live in a bubble, Alexander. But I'll be more careful, I promise." He nodded reluctantly, his thumb brushing her hand. "I can't lose you, Emily. Not after everything." Her eyes softened. "You won't. We're in this together." That night, as she rested, Alexander stayed by her side, his mind filled with gratitude and determination. The scare had reminded him of how fragile life could be, and how much he needed to treasure every moment with the family they had built. After Emily's accident, the family shifted priorities. Alexander reduced his workload, delegating more responsibilities at the foundation to trusted partners. He wanted to be present, not just for Emily but for Ethan and Caleb, who were visibly shaken by the incident. "Mom could have died," Ethan said one evening, his voice trembling as he sat at the kitchen table. Alexander knelt beside him, meeting his son's tearful gaze. "But she didn't. She's strong, Ethan, and she's healing. We'll make sure she's okay." Sitting across from them, Caleb asked, "Dad, what if something happens to you?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He had spent years building an image of invincibility for himself, but his sons were starting to see the cracks in that facade. He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "That's why we have each other. No matter what happens, we're a team. We look out for one another. Always." The boys nodded, though their fears lingered. Alexander decided it was time to take a step that would bring them closer together as a family. The following weekend, Alexander surprised Emily and the boys with a trip to a quiet lakeside cabin. He had visited it as a child, filled with memories of simpler times. "Why are we going all the way out here?" Caleb asked as they drove through winding forest roads. "You'll see," Alexander replied with a smile. When they arrived, the boys tumbled out of the car, wide-eyed at the sight of the sprawling lake and the rustic cabin among the trees. "This is amazing," Ethan exclaimed, running toward the dock. Emily stepped out more cautiously, still recovering from her injuries. "Alexander, this is beautiful. I thought we could use some time away from the city," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Just us." Over the next few days, the family bonded in ways they hadn't in years. They fished, played board games by the fireplace, and roasted marshmallows under a sky filled with stars. One evening, as they sat by the lake, Ethan asked, "Dad, did you come here with your family?" Alexander nodded, gazing at the water. "I did. My parents brought me here when I was about your age. It was one of the few times I saw them truly happy." Emily, sitting beside him, placed her hand over his. "Thank you for sharing this with us. It's where I learned something important," Alexander continued, looking at the boys. "That no matter how busy life gets, family comes first. Always." Caleb leaned against him, his tiny voice cutting through the stillness. "We love you, Dad." Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he hugged his son. "I love you too. All of you." By the end of their trip, the family returned to the city with a renewed sense of unity. Ethan and Caleb's fears had eased, and Emily's resilience shone brighter than ever. Alexander, for his part, felt a profound shift within himself. The cabin had reminded him not only of the family he had lost, but of the one he had now, the one he would do anything to protect and nurture. As they settled back into their routine, Alexander made a quiet vow to never take another moment for granted. The Dawson Carter Foundation flourished over the next year, its impact rippling far beyond what Alexander or Emily had ever imagined. Their work became a beacon of hope for families struggling to find their footing, with scholarships, housing assistance, and medical support helping hundreds reclaim their lives. But for Alexander, one promise remained unfulfilled. He had vowed to create a world where Ethan and Caleb could see their parents as examples of strength and compassion, but one lingering challenge was rebuilding their relationship with Daniel. One evening, as the family gathered in their living room, Caleb innocently asked, "Dad, do we have an uncle?" The question caught Alexander off guard. Emily looked up from her book, her expression cautious but understanding. The boys were old enough now to know the truth, and Alexander had no intention of hiding it. "Yes, Caleb," he replied, his voice steady. "You do have an uncle. His name is Daniel, my brother." Ethan frowned. "Why don't we ever see him?" Alexander hesitated. "It's complicated. Daniel made some choices in the past that hurt our family. But he's still my brother, and I've been thinking about giving him a chance to make things right." Emily placed a hand on his arm, silently supporting his decision. "Do you think he'll want to see us?" Caleb asked, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, "but I think it's worth trying." A week later, Alexander contacted Daniel, inviting him to dinner at their home. It was a tense decision that filled Alexander with hope and trepidation. Daniel's initial response was hesitant, but eventually he agreed. When the night arrived, the boys were bubbling with excitement, unaware of the weight their father carried. Emily prepared a simple yet welcoming meal, her calm demeanor grounding Alexander. When the doorbell rang, Alexander opened it to find Daniel standing on the threshold, looking more uncertain than Alexander had ever seen him. "Alex," Daniel said, his voice low. "Daniel," Alexander replied, stepping aside to let him in. The boys peeked out from the kitchen, their eyes lighting up at the sight of their uncle. "You're taller than Dad," Ethan declared, breaking the tension with a laugh. Daniel chuckled nervously, ruffling Ethan's hair as he entered. "I guess I have that going for me." Throughout the evening, the atmosphere gradually eased. Daniel was charmed by the boys' openness and Emily's warmth, though his guilt over past actions lingered. After dinner, when the boys ran off to play, Daniel turned to Alexander. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said quietly. "To you, to Emily, to the boys. I let my fear and jealousy blind me and made terrible choices. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it." Alexander studied his brother for a long moment. "What you did caused a lot of pain, Daniel, but I also know how hard it is to carry the weight of regret." Daniel nodded, his expression solemn. I want to make things right if you'll let me. It'll take time, Alexander admitted. But if you're willing to try, so am I. Emily watched the exchange, her heart lifting as she saw the two brothers take the first steps toward reconciliation. As Daniel left that evening, Ethan ran up to him with a drawing. Here, Uncle Daniel. It's a picture of our family. You can have it. Daniel looked at the childlike sketch. Stick figures of Alexander, Emily, Ethan, and Caleb, with a new figure labeled Uncle Daniel. He smiled, tears welling in his eyes. Thank you, Ethan. This means a lot. As the door closed, Alexander felt a sense of relief. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a new beginning. A year later, the Dawson Carter Foundation celebrated its second anniversary with an event in the same community center where it had launched. Families the foundation had helped came to share their stories, and the atmosphere was alive with gratitude and hope. Ethan and Caleb ran around the venue, helping Emily greet guests while Alexander prepared his closing speech. As he looked out at the crowd, he saw faces filled with inspiration. People who had overcome unimaginable odds, now thriving because of the support they had received. Alexander stood on the stage with his family when it was time for him to speak. He paused, taking in the moment before addressing the audience. 2 years ago, this foundation began as a way to right the wrongs of my past. But today, I see that it has become so much more. It's a testament to what can happen when people come together to support one another. He glanced at Emily, his voice softening. My wife has been the heart of this journey. Her strength, resilience, and compassion have shown me what true courage looks like. The audience applauded, and Emily squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. But the real legacy of this foundation isn't the buildings we've renovated or the scholarships we've awarded. It's the lives we've touched, the hope we've restored, and the future we're building together. As Alexander stepped off the stage, Ethan and Caleb rushed to him, hugging him tightly. You did great, Dad, Ethan said, beaming. Can we help more people next year? Caleb asked eagerly. Alexander laughed, his heart full. That's the plan. Later that evening, as the family walked home under the glow of city lights, Alexander looked at Emily and the boys, a profound sense of peace settling over him. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led to this, a life filled with purpose, love, and connection. Emily slipped her hand into his. What are you thinking? She asked. That I finally understand what legacy means, he replied, his voice steady. It's not about what you leave behind. It's about the lives you touch while you're here. She smiled, leaning into him. Then I'd say we're building something pretty special. As they reached their doorstep, Caleb tugged on Alexander's sleeve. Dad, will you tell us a bedtime story? Alexander grinned. How about the story of a family that learned to love, forgive, and grow stronger together? Ethan chimed in. That sounds like the best story ever. As they entered their home, laughter and warmth filled the air, a reflection of the life they had built and the promise of all the moments yet to come. This wasn't just the end of one chapter for Alexander, Emily, Ethan, and Caleb. It was the beginning of a legacy they would continue to write together, one day at a time.